Hello, everyone. Welcome to another SpringDocs Q&A. My name is Camelia Shofani, and I am the Director of Public Programs and Events here at IDA. I'm a light-skinned Mexican Palestinian woman with dark curly hair, dark eyes, and a black pullover. I want to thank our media sponsors, Variety and KCRW, for sponsoring our 2023 SpringDocs Showcase. Tonight, we'll be having a conversation between Variety's Hollywood correspondent, Julie Miller, and director Julia Willoughby Nason, and showrunner Michael Gasparro, whose series, Murdaugh Murders, A Southern Scandal, is currently streaming on Netflix. For more info on our current lineup, please visit www.documentary.org/SpringDocs. Before we start, I'd like to offer a brief land acknowledgement. We recognize the Gabrielino Tongva and Chumash peoples as the past, present, and future caretakers of the land, water, and cultural resources in the unceded territory of Los Angeles. Thank you so much, Andrea Lust, for ASL interpreting this discussion. And now I'm going to pass it to Julie Miller. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for a conversation about the documentary series Murdaugh Murders, A Southern Scandal. My name is Julie Miller. I have brown hair and I'm female wearing a navy blue shirt. And I'm joined by director and executive producer Julia Willoughby Nason and executive producer and showrunner Michael Gasparro. Do you want to take a second to describe yourselves?
Sure. I'm Julia Willoughby Nason, and I'm blonde, and I have a black and white picture in the background, and I'm the director and EP on this show.
Hey, and I'm Michael Gasparro, and I have a charcoal-ish shirt on and some picture frames behind me, and I have brown hair.
Great. Well, I'm so happy to be able to speak to you both because I've been just obsessed with this trial and the subject, like everybody really has in the nation. And what struck me about your docuseries really was the testimony of Morgan Dowdy, who was Paul's ex-girlfriend, and she had this really unique insider perspective. She had spent so much time with Alec, with Maggie, with Paul, and I hadn't heard her account before at all. Michael, I know that before this started, you were on the ground doing recon, meeting people in Hampton County and sort of making introductions, getting people on board to speak to the docuseries. Can you tell us a little bit about that process and about sort of convincing Morgan that this would be a safe space for her to share her story?
Sure. Yeah, it's been a minute because it was, I think, the summer of 2021 we started to dig into this story, and it was, I think, early fall is when we started to get people on board. Morgan was, for us and Julia and the team, the kids were the most important part of the story for us. That was the angle that we wanted to go in. We knew there was other projects being made, and it was really important for us to get the kids on board. So, that is, I think, there's so many hard parts in making a documentary. You're always like, this is the hardest part. And then you're like in post and you're like, that's not, whatever it is. But, really getting these kids on board was really tricky for us. And Morgan particularly is a really strong-willed kid. And she was going through a lot. I'd reached out to her myself, through Instagram and the first thing she said back to me was, I'm good, fuck off. And I appreciated that because I think that's probably something I would say too. So I knew that we would eventually become friends, and we have, but we found an angle to get in there, and we, from the great thing that we have is our past projects, and that's kind of all you have, because we're just random people that are like, come sit down and tell us your life story to millions and millions of people. It's really a precarious situation. So the only thing that we have is our calling card, and it's like, hey, listen, please go look at our projects, and we care about victims, we care about survivors, and we have a safe space for you to tell your story. And that was kind of how we got her in, and she wanted to tell her story. Many people wanted to get her story, and she knew that she would have to do it. And I think it was just about the relationship that we ended up forming, and the trust factor, and then also the projects that we've done in the past, that this is going to be a safe place for you to sit down and talk to Julia and talk to Jenner. And that's kind of what won her over.
And Julia, so when you sat down with her and with the other group of Paul's friends, I'm curious how that works as a director with those subjects. Do you have a series of conversations before, obviously you sit down and begin filming? How do you sort of build that trust? Because I imagine that you also have to establish that.
Yeah, sitting down with the subjects that are sensitive and have been through a lot, and actually took a lot even to get to sit down, as a director, it can work a couple different ways of interacting at first with the subjects. Sometimes we'll spend a lot of time, getting to know them off camera, building trust this way. Sometimes we find that it's almost more efficient and straightforward to meet them right when we're sitting down with them for the first time, and have, very prepped on our end questions. And we know that these interviews will be very, be long and in depth. And so we cover a lot of ground, and we do explain to them, and check in with them throughout that, how the process is going in real time during the interview. So it's changed over the years, but I think that having almost an insulated relationship with the subjects can help them feel like they're on neutral ground, and they're just coming in and being held in a, in a supportive way that doesn't have any judgment associated with it coming in.
And you could have told the story from so many different perspectives, and you could have divided it up a million different ways. And you chose to start out with the boat accident. And I didn't realize until watching this docuseries that if it hadn't been for that boat accident and for Mark Tinsley, Mallory Beach's lawyer, we probably wouldn't be in the position where we are now, with Alec finally being held accountable. Can you talk about your process of sort of realizing that that was the right entry point?
Mike, do you want to start, or no?
Go ahead.
I think Mark Tinsley really stuck his neck out here as a lawyer, especially as a local lawyer. I mean, he knew the Murdaughs, not intimately, but professionally, just, in passing. And he, I think he was like a super dogged, professional lawyer to understand that this was a precipice of exposing years of corruption through asking for Alec's financial records when he claimed that he had no money to pay for the lawsuit around his son, crashing the boat and killing Mallory. So yeah, I mean, I think that was, with all our stories, we try to go in the smallest little crack of, a system that feels impenetrable. And through that lens, usually we find that the intimacy of a storyline or a human being's vulnerability opens up a huge web of the tales we weave, as Alec would say on the stand.
Do you have anything to add to that, Michael?
No, yeah, I mean, I think that for us, it was this event that happened that is very relatable to, I think most people, like someone, these are kids that made bad decisions and something tragic happened. If it's a boat, it's a car, it's not an unusual thing. What's unusual is the power and all the other things that Alec and this, this family potentially was up to for 100 years. So that was the one most relatable thing to go in, and something so innocent almost brought down this massive, family. And we didn't, that was where we were going. There was, we were doing that 100%. But even when we were watching the trial, and we could talk to that when we want to get there, but Julie and I were obsessed with the trial, obviously, and every moment I went to the trial. But we didn't realize even, we kind of knew that Mark was going to be, it was his, he was the main theory and all this stuff, but like, we didn't know the stuff about Alec saying, the first thing he said was, this is about the boat. It's a long story. So even watching that, we were like, we knew it, but like, we didn't see that stuff until we saw the trial. And it was, pretty unbelievable.
Let's talk about the trial a little bit, because you had by that point, I think, been spending, you spent, I think, 2 years maybe working on the subject matter in such micro focus, spending so many hours talking to a ton of people, doing such research. So what was it like to finally see him take the stand? It must have been so surreal.
Yeah, seeing Alec take the stand was frightening and very surreal, because this is this infamous giant of, deceit potentially that is actually going to be, putting words to his actions in real time in front of a jury. And, he's a lawyer, and we got to really experience, I think, his performance in depth. I mean, I think he was on trial for definitely 2 days, but maybe like over 10 hours or something like that. So just I feel like when you watch him you can just press play at any point in his testimony, and you get this same feeling of spinning, of the way he uses grammar, of the way he kind of takes the prosecution or the defense's questioning and using it to his own advantage. It's an art form that I think we see a lot in in politics and in mainstream media, that was interesting to see in this case because of how much we had invested personally.
Right. Michael, what about you?
Yeah, no, it was surreal. I think it was, we're watching, we've been working on this for, over a year and a half, almost 2 years, and you're seeing characters, that's a terrible word. You're seeing people like, Valerie, who's in the seats behind the prosecution. You're seeing Will Folks, these are real people, but, they're folk, they're the journalists that are in our documentary. They're in the courtroom, and you're seeing, the family members, and you're seeing Buster, and you're seeing Alec, and you're seeing John Marvin, you're seeing these people. And it's pretty surreal, the whole, and just to sort of see how it unfolds, because we knew things, but we still learn so much just seeing, testimony from different folks that are part of the story. And it was like, I went there for a couple of days, and it was like Stockholm syndrome. It was like you're in there with all these, and these journalists are there for 6 weeks. It was supposed to be 3 weeks. And, the judge has a 10-minute break, and you have the family talking to people, and it's a very surreal atmosphere. And I don't think either of us, I don't know if Julia thought, I didn't think it was going to be as big as it was, the trial itself, like, OJ, size audience,
Right.
basically.
Oh my gosh. Well, the evidence is so damning against him, but Alec does have this sort of folksy charm, which is how he got away with the things he did for as long as he did. There was a part of me that was a little bit worried that the jury wouldn't find him guilty. Did you have that concern as well, or no?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I didn't think this was an easy case to win, to find a guilty verdict at all. It was all circumstantial evidence. There was no eyewitnesses. There was no murder weapons recovered. And this is, Alec Murdaugh, the Murdaugh family, they have such a stronghold on all the legal system down there and law enforcement. I mean, I felt like, for the prosecution, it potentially was an uphill battle, but they were prepared. I mean, the cell phone data was, the alibi in the end. So, I mean, Alec tried to have it his alibi, and then it became the prosecution's alibi, essentially, or justice's alibi. But yes, that's the old folky Southern charm, and the kind of that insipid quality of luring people in with kindness is the Southern way in general. That is a byproduct of America's original sin.
Right. Michael, did you have anything to add, or?
No, I think we definitely had. I would talk to Mark Tinsley, and he was like, no, he's going to be found guilty. There's no doubt. But when I was in the courtroom and looking at the jurors, and there was like a juror who was just not paying attention, and I think that ended up being the egg lady who went and got her eggs at the end. But I was like, they're taking Buster's photo painting off the wall. I mean, this was their neighborhood. Carleton County was the Murdaughs. They own this. So I was with Julia. I was like, there's no way. And I think it was the Rogan Gibson Bubba video that did him in.
Right. And Michael, I think it was you who maybe reached out to Alec's people throughout the production process to see if he wanted to respond or participate in any way. Can you talk a little bit about those discussions?
I had been, there was multiple people that was in the Murdaugh camp, and that's just something we have to do, is we have to reach out to every single person involved. That's making a documentary. You need people's perspective. We wanted Maggie's perspective, her side. They wouldn't talk, and understandably. But as far as, I spoke to many people. I reached out to everybody in the family. I spoke to someone in the law firm. I spoke to Dick Harpootlian's press person. They basically were saying that, they're not going to talk to anybody until it's over, potentially. It was tricky. You try to get in as many different ways, and, lots of unanswered texts and phone calls. And, I tried every angle, and, you have to do that because you don't want anybody saying they never reached out to us.
I love how the docuseries ends with that phone call Alec makes to Buster, and he mentions the Netflix project. How does that work in terms of getting audio of those phone calls from prison?
We did it through FOIA, Freedom of Information Act. So we've done that before. We did it in our Trayvon documentary. It's just a legal process, and they're public in certain. There were some issues with them, but we got troves of them, and then we go through them, and then obviously you flag the ones that you think are interesting. And obviously when you hear him talk about Netflix, we're like, okay, well, that's a good one. We knew that we were hoping, I think, that would be an ending, but we just had to navigate it, I think, with Netflix too.
There must have been so many other interesting, fascinating revelations from those phone calls. Are there any specific exchanges that come to mind now that you weren't able to include?
The hunting, did we talk? I think there was many. There were so many different ones. The hunting.
I just felt like the tone of the calls that Alec was having with family members on the jailhouse calls and different lawyers, he felt very cavalier, and kind of like, everything's going to be okay, I got this feeling. And kind of, that's a hard position I don't want to judge too much, but there was like this kind of like, I might be behind bars, but I'm still like wondering what you guys are doing in your baseball games, and like out in Vegas, like people took pictures of you, like this type of, I don't know. There was a hubris aspect to it.
Yeah. And what's wild is that obviously there are different ways that you can communicate, and they know that these calls are public in some capacity, that you can get them. So these people are not stupid. I think there may have been calls that were, they were talking about certain things that were about something else. They're having conversations about Ronnie Crosby, the lawyer, he's like, hey, Bubba, you want to, or Buster, you want to go hunting on Moselle? You know, this is where his mother and brother were murdered. And he's saying in these calls, like, hey, do you want to go hunting? And he's like, nah, I'm good. He's like, well, okay, well, Ronnie's going to go. This is your lawyer's going to go hunting on. So it's a different, I mean, it's completely bonkers, to be honest.
Right. You started working on this, I think, September 2021, right after Alec was shot on that side road. And of course, later we realized that Alec actually asked that guy to shoot him. He was so desperate. But this story was very much unspooling in crazy fashion as you were making this docuseries. Can you talk a little bit about that and whether there were certain developments that caused you to have to make U-turns in the making of this? Or was that a regular thing?
No, I'm just trying to like think about.
Oh.
Yeah, Mike, do you remember any like specific U-turn? I feel like the
No,
whole
but
thing.
what you go through is like anything, is like you go home after you shoot and you have conversations and you come up with your own thoughts and theories. It becomes really, you, like you said, you get into this zone and you're in this world, and we're, you know, like New Yorkers, and we're in this small community that's very different from anything that I've grown up, and I know Julia as well. So you kind of just, yeah, of course. I mean, listen, by the time we were in there, there were so many twists and turns, and it was becoming a film in itself. But when you're in there, it's like, it's hard to, you know, sometimes you're just like, is this person telling me the truth? Is this person telling me the truth? You start to question the people and the things, and it becomes, because there is always multiple sides. There's always multiple sides to a story and someone's perspective, and it's trying to sift through that and you know, find the path forward and tell the, you know, the best version of that. But I think those are the roller coasters. I think yeah, other than that, I think a lot of things had happened by the time we were like, you know, in there doing it. But other than like, is this person part of it? Are we being, you know, there's always that thing. You have that, like, you go down these like weird tunnels, and then you're like, you know, you come out of it eventually.
Right. Julia, when we talked before, you mentioned that in speaking to these people, you discovered other potential crimes committed and other potential allegations. Can you talk a little bit about kind of all of the things, all the rabbit holes you could have gone down and had to pull yourself back from? Because that's something I always struggle with in my stories. And I imagine that's something you dealt with to a much greater degree.
Yes, definitely. There were, you know, the storylines of Stephen Smith's murder and Gloria Satterfield's death, and, you know, the history of the Murdaughs being connected to potentially drug smuggling with certain families off the coast. And, you know, all of these kind of stringy things that we would hear about that all tied back to the Murdaughs was, you know, fascinating. But as storytellers, we had to keep the focus. We had to say, like, these are ongoing, quote, investigations at the end of the day, but here's our core, which is, you know, the boat wreck and the young adults whose lives were affected. And Alec Murdaugh's in that realm is kind of like a byproduct that shows like this bigger system in the background that is crumbling, and the corruption and all the layers you know, within that are just touch points at the end of the day. We wanted to always circle back to who our main cast was here. Because like you said, like there's so many rabbit holes to go down, and we did. You know, we wanted to see if there was any kind of thing that we could tie directly to our core subjects in only 3 parts, because this is only 3-part series. If we had a longer time, you know, if we were doing like kind of like a trilogy, like Lord of the Rings here, we definitely would have expanded all the rabbit holes into like these intense tunnels of revelation, which are still on the table for anybody who wants to investigate this case. And there's so many people writing books these days, and et cetera, et cetera. So this is a ripe story for any investigator. It never ends.
There are, yeah, it should be Lord of the Rings. It is. Yeah, there are full characters that we did not include that are 100%, and then they're probably going to get, you know, there's still all these open cases. There's folks that are going to be charged. There's still all this money stuff that the prosecution and the AG's office is still going to bring in front of Judge Newman. So there's things that are going to happen over the years of people, and you're going to start hearing about people. I mean, full people that we believe, and we could have used them, but we took them out because, like Julia said, we're making this show, and it has to be digestible to a wide audience. It gets convoluted when we start talking about this person, but it's fascinating, and there are a lot of characters that we basically didn't put in because of the focus aspect of it.
Right. I'm curious, what are you interested to see? I'm curious what plot lines you're still interested in seeing unfold in the Murdaugh family and their saga.
I think that Alec had help. And I think that he couldn't have, I think that if that means after the fact, not particularly the murders, I think Alec pulled the triggers, but I do feel like there's something that happened after that he potentially had help. I'm curious about that. And then there's other characters that I think will eventually will find their way to, in front of Judge Newman. But I think that there is, and the drug aspect to that, we've heard that multiple times, that there's many stories about Moselle, the property itself, the history there. There's too much there. But I think the more pressing thing, which would be interesting to see come, is the who helped Alec, and did someone help him?
Interesting. Julia, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, I agree with Mike, just definitely along those lines. That would be fascinating to really unpack. I think that there's some definitely elements left untold in that realm. I also think, the ongoing investigation of the murder of Stephen Smith, I would like to see how that unfolds.
You've worked together on other true crime docuseries, Lula Rich docu-projects, Fire Fraud, The Pharmacist. What did this one teach you both, though? I imagine this one was so much more complex in so many different ways, but I'm curious of what you came out having learned.
Yeah, I think that this one, was so much about our legal system. And we were on the side of the white collar criminals and, the Caucasians here. So I think that it was interesting to kind of see that devolve, that power structure devolve. A lot of our work has been on the other side, where the legal system has not worked for people of color. So this was different. This was kind of embedding with another point of view within the legal system.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I learned about hunting. They really like to shoot deer in the South, and I learned about Tacova cowboy boots, which I've bought a few pair. But yeah, I mean, yeah, it's always about relationships and the people, and that to me is always the you end up in these people's lives. So I think this was just, trying to have empathy for people that are living there that are not directly a part of it. And, that was probably my takeaway.
And given how much material is left on the table and how many characters and unexplored rabbit holes there are you interested in toying with the idea of returning to the subject matter?
I think we're still batting it around. I think it's really, we would only, obviously, I think you have to ask Netflix about that one.
Okay. Well,
I
I hope it comes to fruition, because I would gladly watch more episodes of this. It was so restrained just to keep it to 3.
You should tell Netflix that. I agree. You should actually call them after this. I actually think they're probably listening right now, and you should tell them there should be 10 more episodes.
Yeah, exactly.
I will do that. Well, Michael and Julia, thank you so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Good to talk to you.